The Two-Headed Nightmare. One quiet night, when the entire pig family was asleep, strange things began happening in the house. Peppa and George were awakened by an odd rustling sound. At first, they thought it was just the wind outside, but with every passing moment, the sound grew louder and closer. Peppa and George were scared and decided to go downstairs to find out what was going on. As they approached the staircase, they saw dim light coming from the kitchen. They quietly crept toward the door and peeked inside. What they saw made them freeze in terror. Mama and Papa Pig were standing in the middle of the kitchen, but their bodies were distorted. Instead of two separate figures, they had fused into one giant form with two heads on a single body. One face was Mama Pig's, the other was Papa Pig's. Their faces were twisted with grotesque smiles, and their eyes were filled with emptiness. They started moving, their skin and bones creaking. Peppa and George were terrified, but they couldn't look away. Suddenly, one of the heads turned toward them and spoke in an eerie voice. "You shouldn't have seen this." Their voices merged into one, creating a strange, hoarse whisper that penetrated deep into their souls. The creature began to move toward the children, its movements jerky, as if it couldn't control its own body. The shadows on the walls began to distort, as if the shadows themselves were part of this monster. Peppa and George felt their hearts pounding with fear, and cold sweat covered their bodies. They tried to run, but the two-headed mutant was already too close. It rushed toward them with lightning speed despite its bulky form, and for a moment Peppa and George were trapped in its grasp. With every passing second, they felt their strength leaving them, as if they were losing the very essence of their existence. Just as they were about to lose consciousness, the monstrous figure stopped. Instead of consuming them, it turned and began to disappear into the shadows. All that remained of their parents were the haunting echoes of their voices, now resonating in every corner of the house. Peppa and George realized that they were no longer children, but mere victims of this nightmare. The next morning, when they woke up, the house was quiet again. Mama and Papa Pig had vanished. Everything around them was the same as before, but there was now a strange, oppressive silence in the air, and Peppa and George could no longer feel the warmth and safety of home. But they knew the nightmare had not ended. It would always follow them like a shadow, for no one can escape the dark forces hidden within their own parents. The loss of color. One morning, the pig family woke up, and everything in the house seemed strange. Peppa and George noticed that their toys on the shelf looked a little dull, and the bright pictures on the walls had become faded. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual, and the parents didn't pay much attention to it. But by evening, the situation worsened. Mama Pig put a cup on the kitchen table and noticed that it had turned a strange gray color. Daddy Pig put down a newspaper, and it too started losing its bright color, turning into a dull shade. Everything they touched gradually lost its color, as if their world was becoming more and more muted. The next day, when Peppa and George woke up, the whole house was nearly devoid of color. The carpets on the floor, the furniture, even the fruits in the kitchen, everything had turned gray. In the evening, when Peppa looked out the window, she noticed that the trees and the sky had also lost their vibrant hues and became cold and colorless. Even the sun, which usually brought warmth, now seemed dim, as if its light couldn't break through the darkness. Peppa began to worry that something very bad was happening, but Mama and Daddy Pig reassured her that everything would be fine. However, with each passing day, the color in the house disappeared more rapidly. Peppa tried to bring something back into her room, but her toys became increasingly dull, and the books and other things seemed to be fading right before her eyes. One night, Peppa woke up and noticed that the house had become completely dark, even though the lamps were on. She went down the hallway and discovered that even the light in the lamps had become faint and cold. When she reached the kitchen, she saw that even the fire in the fireplace had gone out, and instead of warmth, it gave off only cold. Peppa realized that the disappearance of color wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was something much more terrifying. She went to find her parents, but they looked just as dull as everything else around them. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but his face was gray, and he didn't even notice when Peppa approached. As soon as she touched him, everything around them began to disappear again. There was no more sound or light in the house. Peppa felt her own body becoming more and more pale and transparent, as if she too was losing her form. In the final moment, when the entire house was consumed by the gray color, Peppa heard the warm voice of Granny Pig, who explained that this was the result of forgotten joys and clouded memories. When happiness fades from the world, when things no longer bring joy, color begins to disappear. And in the end, everything, even the ones closest to you, becomes consumed by shadow. Peppa tried to find a way out, but everything around her became even more dull, and eventually she disappeared, leaving an empty, colorless space. Everything that had once been bright and alive was swallowed by the darkness. Behind the closed-door night had fallen in Peppa Pig's house. After dinner, she and George went upstairs to their room, changed into their pajamas, and climbed into bed. The evening was just like any other. Mummy Pig came in to say goodnight, turned off the light, and left the door slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of warm light from the hallway to spill into the room. The familiar silence settled in, broken only by George's steady breathing as he quickly drifted off to sleep, curled up under his blanket. A few hours passed. Outside, the sky was completely dark, and pale moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. Then Peppa woke up. She didn't know what had stirred her from sleep, but a strange uneasiness settled deep inside her the moment she opened her eyes. The room looked the same as always, stuffed animals in the corner, books neatly arranged on the shelves, the nightlight sitting on the bedside table. But something felt wrong. A chill crept down her spine as she realized what it was: the door. When she had gone to bed, the door had been slightly open, letting the soft glow from the hallway seep in. Now it was shut tight. Peppa slowly sat up in bed, her breath shallow. The door had never closed on its own before. Someone must have pushed it shut. But she hadn't heard any footsteps, no creak of the floorboards, no movement at all. Her gaze flickered toward George, still fast asleep, unaware of the growing fear inside her. She hesitated, then carefully slid out of bed, placing her feet on the cool floor. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, pressing against her like an invisible weight. Step by step, she crept toward the door, barely daring to breathe. She reached for the doorknob, turned it gently, pulled. Nothing. The door wouldn't open. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip, pulling harder this time. The knob didn't even budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. A deep, sickening dread filled her chest. She swallowed hard and pressed her ear against the wood. The hallway should have been quiet. There should have been nothing there. But there was something. She couldn't hear it move, couldn't hear it breathe, but she could feel it. The presence was unmistakable, heavy, cold, and waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then the sound came, a soft, deliberate knock. Once, twice, 3 times. Each knock was slow, calculated, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for her to respond. Peppa stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The fear was unbearable now, wrapping around her like icy chains. And then it spoke. The voice was hers, exactly hers. Calm, familiar, slightly sleepy, like an echo of herself. But something was wrong. It was too smooth, too measured, too empty. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen. At some point, she swore she saw the doorknob twitch. Just slightly, just enough to let her know it was still there. Without thinking, she turned and rushed back to bed, pulling the covers over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. She knew that if it wanted to, it could come in, but it didn't. The night stretched on, silent and endless, and in the morning the door was slightly open again. as if nothing had ever happened. Endless night. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Usually, even at night, her room wasn't completely dark. Street lights outside, the soft glow of the moon, the faint light from her night lamp. But now she was surrounded by absolute darkness. She blinked, trying to adjust to it. But nothing changed. The darkness was thick, like heavy smoke, like a black veil that had covered the entire house. Peppa slowly sat up in bed. A strange unease tightened in her chest. She reached out, found her night lamp, and flicked the switch. The light did not turn on. Peppa frowned. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. She walked to the window and cautiously pulled back the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside was endless, bottomless darkness. No moon, no stars, no distant glows from the neighbors' houses. Only black emptiness. Peppa pressed her face against the glass, straining her eyes to see anything. But the longer she looked, the more it seemed like the dark mass outside was moving. Like it was alive. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned and ran out of her room. The house was silent. Too silent. She called for Mummy Pig, for Daddy Pig, for George. No answer. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly open. Peppa froze in the hallway. She didn't want to go inside, but she had to. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The beds were empty. The blankets were neatly tucked in, as if they had never been used. Peppa took a step back. This was not her house. It couldn't be. She ran downstairs to the front door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. She rushed to the living room window and pressed her face to the glass. The town was motionless. The streets were swallowed in thick blackness. The houses stood as silent shadows. Usually there would be lights in the windows, but now not a single house was glowing. Not a single sound. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, no rustling wind. Only silence. Peppa stepped outside. The cold air pricked her skin. She walked down the road, glancing around. No one. She reached the town square where her friends usually played, but where the town should have been, there was now a vast, endless void. The ground abruptly ended, like the town had been erased, leaving only this black abyss behind. Peppa stepped back, her heart pounding, and then in the silence a sound echoed, a slow, heavy footstep. Peppa turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the empty street, tall, motionless, faceless, blending into the darkness. The figure did not move, but Peppa felt its gaze on her. She took a step back. The figure came closer. It didn't walk, it just was suddenly nearer. A deep fear settled in her chest. She turned and ran. But with every step, the road beneath her feet disappeared. The houses melted into the void. The town was vanishing, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She fell to her knees, looking around frantically. Nothing. Only emptiness. And then, breathing. Software. Cold. Right behind her. A whisper. Someone said her name. She spun around. The darkness collapsed. And then, nothing. The next morning, the town was gone. Not a single soul remained. Only endless night, and someone standing at its center. Someone who remembered how things used to be. But now, everything belonged to the darkness.